I'd like to do this interactively. So has everyone noticed that I'm wearing a jacket? I would like this to be interactive, and so that means you can interrupt me and object. We can even have an argument. I love arguments. I wouldn't recommend it. No, I'm just kidding. I hope there'll be some things that challenge your thinking a little bit, and we'll talk about it later, perhaps. Title slide. We're looking this evening at shepherding the flock. Next week will be shepherding the sheep, and then next week is shepherding the sheep as well. So we're going to have 2 lessons on shepherding sheep. And you're probably saying, what's the difference? Shepherding aren't flock sheep, and I think Russ already gave you an introduction to those 2 categories. Here's the agenda. And yes, it is 3 times in a row, isn't it? Including the 4th of July, but that's okay. That's correct. So if my time gets up, then you mute the mic. Is that the way we're doing this tonight? That's a joke. You may not appreciate what that's referring to. There's another event of people doing something I think less spiritual tonight as well. Anyway, that's it. So goals that have presented, and I'll show you the ones that I would like to address tonight. A deeper appreciation of God's plan for elders serving in his kingdom and the wisdom of that plan. We are going to look closely at several texts that really have to do with the plan for elders, God's plan for elders. Providing awareness of the practical day-to-day work. I'm going to show you, this is foolishly perhaps, a national job description of a modern-day elder doing flock shepherding. And you can look at it, and you can be sure we left out the biggest thing, and just putting too much into it. But that's just an attempt, and I think Russ showed you the training that we've done in the past with the origin of this material. That is an attempt to tell the men, this is kind of what you'll be doing. And there are things you need to learn how to do. They're not in the qualifications, but it's a skill that you need to develop. So you can be better at it. We'll do a little bit better. And then preparing to be ready to serve. And I think if you look at these tasks, in a few cases I'll say, to do this, you've got to be pretty good at it. Standing in front of you. Not in the qualifications. I'm not saying that. I'm not adding qualifications. I'm saying if you really want to be effective, are you going to be standing in front of people? Yeah. Are you going to be standing in front of people saying tough things? Yeah. That's hard. And some men are skillful at it. That's a skill that can be developed, as Russ has talked about. So we're really not, I hope Russ said this, and I'm going to never say that again the rest of the lesson for the sake of time. We're not covering the culture. I did write it. Yeah, that's something that's important. You have to work your way. But I also think these things covered over and over. And when we look at another decision, so I'm going to presume there'll be other options. But prepare men to be ready to serve. And by that, I mean not just qualifying yourself by qualifications for 3, but also but also developing skills so when it's time to do it, it's not new and scary. And I think you can be appointed without those skills. Right? It's just hard to be as effective as God. All right. So, flock and sheep shepherd. All right. Y'all know the difference here. Flock shepherd. What that means is there's things that an elder does. Decisions made, fact finding, motivating people to do. But you have to do it with the group as a whole. What's an example? Good. Perfect. So 7:30, 7 here. Somebody's got to. Well, there are deeper things too. Who's going to come preach? What are we going to do for treasure? If we remember, will we all contribute to that or not? And what do we study in the Bible classes? And so on. So you get the idea. And I think, we'll say this over and over. I think Russ already said it. He's probably said it. So which of these 2 is the most important in terms of what God has in mind for us? Eternal salvation. Yeah. Not the 99. Yeah, that's right. It's protecting the individual Christian by watching, warning, advising, teaching, exhorting, rebuking, comforting, and so on. Each one. And we're going to look at some passages in the New Testament that deal with the work of an elder. I hope you'll be impressed, because I'll forget to say it. But I hope you'll be impressed that almost every one, when you read them, it's not about deciding what time we're going to work. It's not about who's going to come preach. It's not, really how much, what's the budget going to be for this year. It's not about that. Look at it. I'm telling you what the Bible emphasizes. The right-hand side, protecting individuals too. But it does talk about group decision. I mean, here's a little test case, looking back at this chart. What would something like what's described in 1 Corinthians 5, where, remember that man had his father's wife, his stepmother divorced, and actually don't quote that. Better than, sorry. Right, so, but is that, so Paul says, y'all come together in my spirit with you to deliver such a one to be saved, or the instruction plus that the soul to be saved. Is that sheep shepherding or flock? Okay, yeah, both. And it is flock shepherding. In fact, the image there is of leaven. Remember that? Leaven is like the whole lump of bread, and one person's influence, and then others will be, and there's a sense of protecting the flock of the whole loaf of bread. But also, whose benefit really was that actually for? Primarily, that one sheep that needs to have his head turned over. So, my point is that these are related. And you can imagine that a decision made at a flock level is going to affect individual sheep in a certain way. Probably different sheep in different ways. But they are connected. Still, it is a New Testament pattern. Although I think Russ and I are the only ones that have used these terms that I'm aware of, but you just tolerate us and listen. But when we say flock shepherding, we're really talking about group decisions, or decisions for the group. And that's what my topic is tonight, right? Flock shepherding. Next week, sheep shepherding. But here's, take heed to the flock and shepherd the church. That's a collective noun. That means it's a singular noun in grammar form, but it really represents multiple things. Flock is collective. What about church? That's a collective noun too, a group of people. Body, collective noun, made up of members. So you see that's there. And it's similarly in 1 Corinthians 5. Okay. Here's what I'd like to talk about. I'm going to spend a few minutes just telling you where I think our authority comes from to say the things we're saying. You should know these things. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit, just so when we say about it. And then I want to talk about what a church does. Why is that relevant? Collective church body. Why is that relevant to flock shepherding? This is so easily the question. Should not be. Okay, I'm going to talk about what a church does. Why is that relevant to flock shepherding? Yeah, so he's actually leading that collective group. But if we're confused about what a church does, what are their activities, what's their work, we might have the wrong idea of what the leader ought to be and how to judge them, and that. So we'll talk about that. And then the flock shepherding work, job description, etc. And then how do you support that leadership? It's possible I won't get to the last bullet, but we'll try to do that. So I just want you to know there are elders mentioned throughout the Bible. And I think there's some precedent there. In the Old Testament in particular, you see the elders had a prominent role in leading the community in various ways. It's actually 132 references to elders in the Old Testament, believe it or not, including Egyptian elders of all things in Genesis 50. And what they did was they had a corporate rule, like, for example, that passage in Joshua. Joshua called for the elders of Israel, for their heads, for their judges, and for their officers. So they seem to be representing a group of people in that role, a group of people. But also, they sorted out individual matters. If you remember the virginity test thing in Deuteronomy 22, they brought the garment and presented it to the elders, and that's a matter of an individual dispute sometimes. And they had both ceremonial or representative and executive decision-making functions, and I've shown you those examples there. I'll leave these charts. You're free to use them, study them later. I can't cover everything in detail. Where would you go to find what the Bible in the New Testament says about elders' work? What's that?
The book of Acts, where he starts talking about,
Good.
hey, the elders here were doing this.
That's
thing.
right. Matter of fact, elders are kind of first mentioned in the historical book on the first journey. Remember that Paul went through establishing church and came back through establishing or appointing elders in every city. So they're introduced, but not till chapter 11. But okay. But they show up again in Acts 15 in that whole circumcision discussion, and then more throughout the book. We'll look at this. So good. That's good. Some stuff in Acts. Yes, 1 Timothy. Yes, well, so I should have said this. The rule of this game is you can't say 1 Timothy 3 or Titus 1. Okay. Truth, good. Ephesians 4 mentions evangelists, pastors, and teachers in that list of gifts, and we'll look closer at that text. That's good. These are good. Actually, I shouldn't be so dismissive. Titus 1 describes the elders have to refute the gainsayers. That's a task. That's a piece of work to do. But for the most part, it's about what they are, not really about what they do. Okay, good. We're up to 1 Timothy 5. Oh, no, you didn't. But anyway, 1 Timothy 5 is another one where elders that rule well in labor in the word worthy of double honor. That's another one. Any others? What's that? Good, 1 Peter 5. Several of them, there's 3 or 4 that have chapter 5. That helps my memory a little bit. So we've got 1 Timothy 5, 1 Peter 5. Any others?
The end of Hebrews.
Hebrews 13, right. Which is an interesting passage. If you were doing a concordance search, you would never find that passage. It doesn't say elders. It says those who have the rule over you. All right, but that's... All right, here we go. 1 Thessalonians 5. Again, the passage that doesn't call out the name of an elder, but look at it. Verse 11. Therefore, comfort each other and edify one another just as you're also doing. Is that about elders or about all the members? Verse 11. It's up there on the screen. Sounds like it, doesn't it? Each other, everybody can do it. Now in verse 12 it says, we urge you, brethren, to recognize those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord. I don't know what else that could be besides elders. And they admonish you and esteem them highly in love for their work's sake. Be at peace among yourselves. And then verse 14, now we exhort you, brethren. So who's that to? It's everybody. It's interesting that in this text it has to do with y'all encouraging one another and warning one another. The elders' work is stuck in there, right? But before and after, it's just to the whole church. You guys help each other, right? Suggesting that elders are just part of that whole picture of warning and admonishing and encouraging that everybody's involved. 1 Timothy 5. Rule well, be counted worthy, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. So teaching seems like an important thing. Just a parenthesis, we'll say more next week. I don't think you even can do personal counseling without teaching the word. Everything you're going to tell somebody about fixing their personal life or getting out of a problem, avoiding temptation, stepping up to their responsibility, it's going to start with a verse in the Bible, it seems to me, or teaching. It ought to. It ought to. And so they labor in the word. But this maybe has to do, maybe with some more work of evangelist type things. James 5, another 5 chapters. Call for the elders. And they have anointing to do, but the next verse seems to suggest it also has to do with forgiveness of sins, or making a correction, praying for the brother. And I won't say too much more about that, because that's about the limit of what I understand about it. I know different positions. But 1 Peter 5 was mentioned already. And Russ covered this, and the implication there was that these 3 things they weren't supposed to do suggested some things about their office that it's good to know. It is an appointed office, right? Don't take it under control. It does involve money, handling money. Don't do it for filthy lucre, dishonest gain, and so on. It is an authority position, and you might be in danger of lording it over the flock, so don't do that. What we can learn from that as well. So there's 4 references that have chapter 5, and then the lucky chapter, 13. There are actually 3 references, I think, to elders there. Verse 7, remember those who rule over you. Verse 17, obey those who rule over you. and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls, those who escape the trap. Now, if I back up to 5, that is directed to whom? This is command, imperative statement for whom? Everybody? To the elders. But I don't know if you noticed or not, all the other references, who are they to? Take a look at this one. Remember those who rule over you. Obey those who rule over you. Who's that to? It's to people who aren't elders, right? It's the other side of that. Interesting point. 1 Peter 5, of all these, is the only one really directed specifically to elders. Now, Acts 20, which we'll get to, Paul's telling the elders what they need to be doing, right? We'll get to that in a second. It's just like husbands and wives. Are the husbands told, rule over your wives? Make sure they obey you? No, what are they told? Love them. What are the wives told? Obey. You see, we always get the commands we need, not the ones we want, right? The ones we want to hear. And that's true with elders, too. A lot of passages are very specific. You obey them. They rule over you, and that's a strong word. Interesting, it's not directed to the elders, though. It's directed to everybody else who, because we're Christians, we're used to submitting. And we understand about that, where somebody's looking out for my soul. So think about that. Yes, it's a strong word. It is a position of authority. But typical of God's revelation, we're told what we need to hear about that. Okay, Ephesians 4, Paul's discussion of the body and all the things that God's provided. We'll look at more detail of that. But he mentions pastors. Some have connected that where it's really prophets, evangelists, and pastor teachers, because the Greek has a construction that may tie those two words together, but I don't care. I think pastors are teachers. That's the way they lead. That's the way they convince you of certain things. And so it may not be 5 different roles. It may just be 4, but it doesn't matter. And we'll get to that passage later. And then Paul addressed the elders at Ephesus. Not at Ephesus, from Ephesus, at is that right? Sometimes anyway. We may go back and look at that very briefly. But there, Paul is saying, I was with you 3 years. If you want to know what your job is, look at what I did. And several times he says, remember when I was with you, I did this and this and this. He said, I did in every way set an example for you. See there? I've shown you in every way about laboring like this. Paul's intent in calling up his performance, if you want to call it that, in Ephesus was to say, you got to do the same thing. All right, let's see. If I know how to do this. What are they? Quick review. Good. 1 Timothy 5.
Peter 5.
1 Peter 5. James 5. We got the 5s. Hebrews 13, lucky chapter, but 7 and 17, so that makes it. Yeah. And 20. And what's the other?
Acts 20.
Acts 20, Paul and the elders there, and one more.
Ephesians 4.
Ephesians 4. Man, you got it. All right. There's one other piece of information that I think is important, about interpreting Scripture this way. And that is, somebody's already mentioned that elders show up in the book of Acts. The first time they show up is in chapter 11, where the gifts are brought and laid at the feet of the elders for distribution. That's the first time they're mentioned. I always wondered, did Theophilus know what an elder was? It just comes out of nowhere, right? Doesn't say, and by the way, let me explain to you what an elder is. I think he did. First of all, he's probably already a Christian, so he probably worshiped in a church that had elders. But I already showed you that elders are all throughout the whole history of the Old Testament and everything, so that wasn't a surprise. But then after that, you can see in the blue, if you're not colorblind, you can see the blue there. Elders start showing up more prominently. Paul's first journey is appointing elders in every church. In Acts chapter 15, the apostles and elders seem to be on an equal footing, at least on the matter of how do we distribute this truth that we have confirmed here. Send a letter back down to Antioch, and all that. The elders, it says the apostles and elders throughout. So there's almost as if the apostles and elders are on a kind of equal leadership footing there. One time you get to Acts 20, Paul is calling for the Ephesian elders, not the whole church. Come see me. I'm on a trip. I'm trying to go real fast. Come see me. And then finally in chapter 21, the Apostle Paul is greeted coming into Jerusalem by James and the elders and told, you got a bad reputation about your attitude toward the Old Testament law. Please help us not have a division here. We want you to do these certain things. And Paul complied with that. Interesting that kind of is this a role reversal here where the elders are making judgments about the flock and, protecting the flock to the Apostle Paul? So, yeah. And really, you can see some parallels here. The gifts in chapter 4, Barnabas sold the field. You remember that. That's parallel to what's happening here in this chapter, right? And the whole idea of Saul, being accepted as a member in good standing in Jerusalem after he persecuted Christians. Well, it's very similar there. In this case, the elders are standing at the door and saying, we need you to do this before you come in. You see some parallels there. So just like we use Acts 6 to talk about deacons, even though it says they're deaconing tables, they're not called that precisely there. I think we can learn from the apostles' examples when they were doing shepherding things, right, early in the book of Acts. So that's another. If y'all are okay with that hermeneutic, that's kind of where we're going with that, and I think that's a fair assessment. What does the church do? All right. You provide for worship, right? People got to go somewhere to worship. You got to get the Lord's Supper somewhere. Check that thing off, right? Got to get that done.
We teach and edify each other.
Okay, that's one of the 5 acts too, isn't it? I think. Got to remember what they are. What's that? Yeah, so there's this awareness of each other and working with each other to help spiritual as well as perhaps physical needs. Right. I think sometimes we think of the church as something like a dispensary where you go get the necessary stuff, right? I go get my prescription filled, or I go get my box checked, renew my license, or something like that. And if I view the church that way, I'll be kind of annoyed if the parking's lousy, or if the service is inefficient, or it's somehow confusing, right? A better model might be that the church is a place where I go to be entertained. I love singing. I want a good song leader. I mean, that's why I'm going. I'm going to another church if they don't have good singing or good Bible classes, right? So I'm going to meet my needs of being pleased. Maybe that's a better model. I don't know. I don't like it either. And, of course, it's not a business. Y'all would never think it that way, right? Like how our contributions doubled in the last year. Our membership has grown. Do we sometimes measure a church by some carnal measures of money and people and all that? Our reputation is growing in the community, whatever. It's none of those things, as you probably know. We'll get to what it does. But if you think of the church in one of those ways, a dispensary or driver's license bureau, or a pleasant place where I go to do something I love doing, or a business that needs to grow or fail, am I going to pick leaders that kind of match that model? Or I'll prefer them anyway, right? And I want a businessman that doubles the, or I want a guy that makes sure the worship is pleasant and on key and ends on time, for sure, ends on time. Got to have the important things first. Yes? Yes. It doesn't do that, for sure. That's right, yeah. I don't mean to somehow say the church doesn't do those things, but if I'm measuring the success of a church by how pleasant it is for me, I might be missing the point. And we'll talk about that in a minute. In fact, what I'm going to do in a minute, I'll just kind of do a hint now. Are we here to primarily be helped ourselves, or are we here to help other people? Yes, right. Sure, yeah. I'm not saying it's bad, but when Hebrews writer says, exhort one another, I'm pointing outward. I'm singing where? How? How am I singing? One another. I'm teaching and admonishing one another. So the idea is there. Well, of course I'm making melody in my heart. My only point is this. We're tempted to measure groups we're a part of, clubs, official government offices, based on efficiency or pleasantness or something. We can't do that with the church. We've got to understand what the church really does, and I'll show you that in a minute. And you may be surprised at all the things that it actually does. When Christians were together in the New Testament, we have examples of them doing what? Assembled. I'm talking about in the same room. What things did they do? Okay, Lord's Supper, singing, praying, teaching. One other, I always forget what it is. Here they all are. Okay, I'm sure you do. Oh, yeah. Is that all the assembled Christians did in the New Testament? Did they meet together? Meet together for other purposes besides that. Yeah, I'm just going to go fast. They had a problem with widows being neglected. They had to meet together. The whole church met, and the apostles say, here's what we're going to do about it. I think that's a Bible example. To select and appoint those workers. To publicly condemn an unrepentant brother, Matthew 18, 1 Corinthians 5 could be added. Initiate and explain discipline. Reprove elders that sin in the sight of all, that all may be in fear. You getting this? That's what they did when they were in the same room at the same time. Discuss issues and distribute the truth, as in Acts 15. Welcome visitors. If a man in shabby clothes comes in, what's our responsibility? Treat him well. Just the same, maybe better, than the man that comes in rich clothing. I don't know. Teach unbelievers by our orderly worship. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14. If an unbeliever, an ignorant man or something comes in, he'll see the way you worship and acknowledge that God's among you. So I expect part of what we're doing is just so visitors can see when they come in how we are operating. Announce decisions and give feedback, like we're going to pick these men, we're writing this letter, we're sending it to the church in Antioch. Select and appoint workers to go elsewhere. Acts 13, remember that was done publicly, and they laid their hands on Paul and Barnabas in that case. And then guess what happened when they got finished that first journey? They all got back together and heard about the report. These are assembled things that people did. Well, there are other things churches did that were collective. Whether they did it all in one room at the same time, I don't know. But they did it as a group, as a church. They allowed a man to join the church. Do we want to screen members before they're part of our group? Make sure they're Christians for sure, and other things. That happened in Acts chapter 9. The apostles did that. Somehow the Corinthians made a commitment to put together a bunch of money before Paul came back. And what was Paul telling him in 2 Corinthians 8? Do you remember? I'm getting worried. Don't embarrass me. Don't embarrass yourself, But somehow they made a commitment. Could a group like this make a commitment? By this time in April, we're going to put together a fund and selecting men to carry the gifts. Paul said, I'm not carrying it. You pick who you want. Somebody trustworthy. They're carrying the money. They can go with me, but I'm not going to do it. That was the group decision. Asking for a preacher to come is example 1 Corinthians 16. Settling disputes among members, and in particular Euodia and Syntyche. All you help these women. Distribute gifts to the needy, Acts 11. I don't know if that was done in a formal meeting, but they met to consider doctrinal questions. They chose men to send to another church. They sent a letter to other churches. Took actions to avoid problems, as in Acts 21. They gave gifts by the laying on of the hands of the presbyters. I don't know what that means exactly. It may actually be an appointment to a particular task. That's the best explanation I have. They did meet. The elders met to be trained in their work. All of those in the yellow are explicitly elders involved in that commitment. So there's a start at a job description, right? You see where we're going with this? A lot of passages. Okay, if these are all things that churches do, not to mention the other chart, who would lead in this group decision making? Well, it seemed like the elders would. That's what the precedent is in the Old Testament. Let's look at Ephesians 4. And I want to show you that these group decisions kind of influence the sheep shepherding decisions. See if we can see that in this text. Paul's writing to the Ephesians. He gave some to the apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors. There's our word. Russ talked about the different terms, I know. Those are elders and teachers. 4, equipping of the saints for the work of the ministry. What is that? It's the edifying. What's another word that edifying instead of edifying? Building up, like edifice kind of thing. Okay? So think building up. Of the body. What's the body of Christ? It's the church. So building up the body. In this case, probably the local church, the members of the body that met together. Till we all, does that sound like flock or sheep? We all. Flock. Come to the unity of the faith and knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should be no longer children. Does that sound like a flock thing or an individual? Do you think the flock could be child? Or what is he saying here? Is it possible we have children among us, spiritual children? Is everybody here a child in the faith? Certainly not. Okay, keep on going. Not tossed to and fro. Verse 15. Speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things into him who's the head, Christ. From whom the whole body, and notice the body, the whole body, joined and knit together by what every single individual sheep joint supplies, right? According to effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body, again for that. So you notice at the beginning of the text, there are these kind of collective words. We all, and look at the end of the text, every part does its share, every joint and every part. You see, it's like a body all working together. You get that? But in the middle, he's saying the purpose of this is that we don't want anybody to be a child who is tossed to and fro with every wind of doctrine, needing to grow up. That's what children do, right? Here's a diagram of that text. So here's the collective things, and then here's the blue, which I think has to do with the growth of individual Christians. And this is where I'm trying to show you how the flock shepherding is part of the sheep shepherding, really. In the end, that's its purpose. Think about it. We're organizing the worship. We're organizing contribution. We're organizing plans of study. Why? So we'll have a nice church service. No, because we want every single member to grow or be fixed if they're broken, right? Or to become mature if they're childish, or to be corrected if they're in error. You see that? But who's involved in that?
Everyone.
The collective, right? Everyone doing their part and doing their share. So it looks something like this. Gifts, including pastors, are given for equipping the work of the ministry for edifying the body. And he begins by saying, it's till we all come to some unity of the faith, right? And then later he says we're knit together with love. In fact, almost uses the same phrases on both ends, building up of the body and growth of the body and so on. But what's the point, though, is everyone wants to come to the stature of a perfect man, full-grown man. And that includes being protected from false teaching, but also growing up to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So what you see here is that's kind of what we're about here. Every one of us growing. I don't want to disappoint you, but this church will not go to heaven. Are you aware of that? You don't know what I mean by that, right? This church will not be judged in the judgment day. Every individual will. And so what's the point of this outer green stuff here is that you have a cocoon, you have a family, you have a hospital, whatever you want to call the image. Why? Because of this. Now, if I'm an elder, this is sheep shepherding. You might think about it that way. And this is my concern for, I said it wrong. You know what I meant to say. Flock shepherding. But what am I worried most about? This. And will that affect, like, and imagine this is a child and people are not getting along. And there's a bunch of lazy people not doing their share. They could be doing a lot better. Is that going to affect the ability of the individual to grow and be perfected and be corrected and all those things? You see how those work together? And if I'm an elder and I'm working with this stuff, the flock shepherding, well, I'll probably be thinking mostly about this when I make those decisions about who's going to preach, what are we going to study, when will we meet, what are we going to do with our contribution? Those kind of things will be influenced by my concern for the individual sheep. And by the way, everybody's doing that too, through that which every joint supplies. Your primary concern needs to be what? For the adults in the room or the children in the room? The children. And boy, that's hard sometimes. Children are annoying. You notice that? And I mean real flesh and blood babies as well as spiritual babies. They're always getting in trouble. They don't know what they're doing. They make bad decisions. They don't ever think ahead. Right? They get all these knucklehead ideas in their head, and they make bad decisions. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And you don't know whether I'm talking about real babies or if I'm talking about spiritual babies, but it's the same, isn't it? Or should we be annoyed with that immaturity, or should we say, no, that's actually the work we have. That is actually our work. If I think of the church as a business, and somebody's not pulling their load or making a mess out of things, and it's a business, what do I want that person to do? What's that? Get them out. I mean, call HR. What do I got to do to fire this person, right? And it's not easy, but I'm going to do it, right? Is that the way the church looks at people? No. Somebody's struggling. They're counterproductive. They're using a bunch of resources. They're causing a lot of anxiety. What do I want them to do? I want them to grow up. I want to help them grow up. And I'll do a lot of things as a body, as an elder, to help them have that environment so they can. You see how radically different that view is? But we in the church as a business, we'll elect leaders who, like, they fix problems, get them. It's all peaceful. It's always great. But that's not the model. So what are some of the things that they do? I'm skipping this. I had a lot more detail, but for time, go read Acts 20. And here's my list of jobs that Paul gives those elders. Basically saying, do what I did, right? But they proclaim everything, house to house and publicly. That sounds a little bit like sheep and flock shepherding. Declare everything the counsel of God teaches. Watch out for yourself. Be an example. Take heed for what might be coming down the road. Protect them from external threats. Protect from internal threats. Watch and warn night and day with tears, by the way. Provide for your own needs and the needs of others. And he ends by saying this, I have shown you in every way, American Standard says, in all things I gave you an example. By laboring like this, that you must, who? Support what? The people who contribute the most. The founding family of the church. Make sure they don't get upset, right? The big family that if they left would be in trouble as a church. No, who are we supporting the most? What does it say? The weak. Pardon? Yes, well, we all have our weaknesses, I'll guess. But I'm telling you, Paul is saying here, who is your attention on? And that somebody already mentioned the 90 and 9, right? What's that shepherd do? He goes off for the one. And anyway, so, and remember the words that it's blessed, more blessed is with you. So here are some things, like and what I want you to do when you look at this is think of the man who's in that spot doing these hard things. What skills would it be useful for him to have? That's kind of what we're supposed to be doing here, is saying, how do you get ready? Well, one thing you can do is think about, okay, why is that hard? Am I good at some of those things? Make reactive decisions. I don't know if y'all have it here. You probably do. We have it here. Something weird happens in the service, right? Somebody comes in, they come to the front. I don't know. Who's kind of responsible to handle that kind of a strange thing? Probably the elders. I always said the senior pastor should handle it, which was Sewell, of course. The guy comes in with, where's the pastor? He's over there. Anyway, but sometimes, people just get in a squabble. Comes out of nowhere, and you're really surprised. These are reactive decisions. You don't have time to prepare. You don't have time to have an elders meeting and think it through, but you got to address it. And I think you've got to be proactive. You can't be shy. You've got to be at ease in public. You've got to be pretty quick-witted. Or maybe you've thought it through a lot in advance. If this happens, here's what we do. If this happens, here's what we do. Here's the way we handle members that are getting into some type of an argument or something like that. Address disputes. I think you've got to be impartial and confident and tactful in the way you do that. That's going to happen, like the factious men in Titus 3 or Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians 4. Make plans. Look ahead. Say, church, body. Here's what we need to do. This is what we'd like to do. Think about it. Here are the problems we might face. Here are the challenges. Here's a sequence of events that would lead us there. So I think you got to be analytical, meticulous, and you got to motivate people to be able to do that. You agree with this? By the way, these are not in the qualifications. I'm not trying to add to the qualifications. But I'm saying that to be effective, wouldn't it be good if you were skillful in these areas? And thankfully, you may not be skillful in these areas, but you still may be qualified to be an elder. You hope that one of the other elders is pretty good at some of these things. You know what I mean? So you have an eldership that can cover these difficult tasks. Set directions. Take heed to the flock. What's going on? What are potential dangers? What's likely to happen if something, bad comes along, economics or something like that? Watch the outside world. What's happening in the denominational religious world? What's happening in the community? Could that come into the church or not? You got to think about that. What skills would be useful there? I think you got to be observant. You got to have some foresight. You got to be somewhat perceptive, maybe even intuitive about things that might be coming down the road. Can you practice these things without being an elder, by the way? Of course you can. As a matter of fact, I think a lot of jobs require some of these skills. I'm not saying that, because a guy's a great executive, he needs to be an elder. Not saying that. But I know that I had to learn to do some things on my job, standing up in front of people is one of them, right? And be able to talk. I mean, kind of. You can judge that for yourself. But I had to learn that somewhere, and the job worked to help with some of that. So I think even maybe responsibilities you take on, of course, the best training ground is probably what? Family. The man doesn't know how to rule his house. How can he rule the household of God? But I think there are other ways we can develop these skills. More, provide for an edifying worship, right? That would include guidelines for who leads, if there's unscriptural practices or something disorderly. I think you need to be observant, sensitive to other people's reactions, willing to step up and make a plan. Providing spiritual food, maybe the local evangelist, maybe the Bible study plan, maybe selection of teachers. I think you yourself have to be knowledgeable and a good judge of abilities, and you've got to be organized and those kind of things. Again, I'm not adding to the qualification. I'm saying these are skills that will help you do this work. Correct doctrinal error, I kind of know you have to be knowledgeable. That's in Titus, as well as other places. But observant, what's happening, get to it before it's a problem, be proactive, and then lead the public part of congregational discipline. And that requires tactful but forthright communication. It requires that you be at ease in difficult circumstances, which I'm generally not, but I wish I was more skillful. Y'all see what I've tried to do here? This is kind of a job description coming from those things we saw that churches do, and saying, okay, if you're going to do this as a man, you need to be thinking about, are you good at this? How's your knowledge about false teaching? How tactful are you in difficult situations? How organized are you if you're going to try to help manage the Bible classes and things like that? See how these could be worked on as skills beforehand. And as a matter of fact, somebody may need to do it before you have elders. And if the church has confidence and delegates that as a temporary assignment, I think that's a great way to learn these skills as well. So answer me some questions in the 3 minutes we have left. Consider an elder who's making a decision and a plan for a local church. Okay, here's what we're going to do about a meeting place. Or here's what we're going to do, maybe having a preacher come. Here's what we're going to study in our Bible class. What factors, other than that's the cheapest way and the most efficient way, remember we're not a business, what factors might you think about as I'm thinking about what will we study, what preacher might come, where will we meet? What would you be thinking about? What other factors? Have you been listening this whole time? Y'all get the point, right? And I would worry about which members most of all. He said, the ones who struggle, right? And if I did that, how heavily would that be weighted in my decision? I don't want to lose anybody. And if it costs more money and takes more time and some strong members who ought to know better are a little bit offended by that, that's okay. Something more important is going on here. Does that make sense? And will this group decision-making with people-centered considerations, say for the week, thank you very much, will that be quick and easy? No, unfortunately it complicates things. And is it better because there's more elders or less? Does that slow it down or speed it up? It is funny. I didn't intend it to be a joke. But you know what I'm talking about, right? On the other hand, is it helpful to have lots of opinions when we're dealing with these kind of complex things? I don't even know that brother. I just know he's struggling. What's the problem? Well, this other elder is. So it's a helpful situation. Will the decisions then made by an eldership always be understood by the flock? Everybody will understand. Oh, I see. Wait, that's going to cost a lot more money. Or that's going to take a lot longer. Or that doesn't make any sense at all. I don't know what they were thinking. And actually, that's true. You don't, because they were worried about things that maybe other members wouldn't know. Y'all see where I'm going with this in terms of the support? Elders are thinking about things not just efficient and cheap. They're thinking about weak members. That's our job. We're a family. We want to grow babies into adults. We're a hospital. We want to grow sick people into well people where they can become doctors and help make other people. And that's a complicated thing to do, but that's the church. That's the flock in its work. Right? Not a business, not a license bureau, not a club where we come do all the things we like to do. We're here to grow Christians, and that affects everything, including flock shepherding. you kind of get that. All right, how do I support? One chart, but it's got a lot of bullets. First of all, stop thinking about the church as if it were some worldly organization. It's the body of Christ. Shed those views. Obey and submit. That's the command. Be submissive. And why do you submit? Because the elders are the smartest people in the whole church. Right? They're duly elected. Is that why? It says in the text why. Why are we submitting to them? They never make mistakes. They make the best decisions. They're charismatic leaders. No. What's the reason for submitting? It's right there.
They're accountable for your soul.
They're accountable for our souls. Does that strike you as a kind of a serious mission? And think of it that way, not because they deserve all that, but because they have such an important job. What could be a more important job than that? That's going to affect my attitude and tolerance and judgment, assuming the best in every situation. Y'all see where I'm going with this, I hope. Suppress criticism, for sure, of that. And because, of course, I always think about the Israelites. That was their biggest problem. They couldn't stop criticizing Moses in particular, and they got punished pretty badly. And finally, esteem them highly. Again, because they're the most brilliant people, they never make mistakes, they're perfect, they're duly elected. No, because why? Their work's sake. I'm going to take like 30 more seconds with this little illustration. You know, if the building was on fire and we didn't know how to get out, and a fireman came crashing through the door and said, "Follow me and go out," right? Would you stop and think to yourself, you know, he's really too short to be a fireman? Or he's too old or too young? No. Why do I submit to that fireman? Because of how tall he is? No, why? His work's sake. And really, I hardly care what kind of a person he is in any other way. It's that important work that he has. And that's why I submit. And that's the significance. Yep. All right. So I covered the least important topic tonight, flock shepherding. We'll talk about sheep shepherding. Prayer. Great Father, we give you thanks as we once again look at the wisdom, the great wisdom in your word. Help us to adopt the mindset that our souls are what matter the most. That the comfort or reputation and the budget or the size or the pleasantness of our work together is not the measure of the work we're doing here, nor of its leaders. Father, help us to think about the saving of souls as our primary duty. May it influence everything that we do, including the selection and the submission to elders that are selected. We're thankful for this group. I personally thank you for the attention they've given. We pray that these words would be in accordance with your will, and that the references and things that I've provided would be a source of future study to be sure that what I've said is in keeping with your will. Father, keep us safe from physical harm as we travel home, but more important, deliver us from temptation and keep us from the evil one until you welcome us all as individual sheep, adopted children in your family, and all the other beautiful images that you've given us to try to help us understand your love for us and our relationship and our potential glory. Till that day, we offer these praises and these thanks